Imagine trying to balance three bowling balls on a tiny pedestal. It's nearly impossible unless they each have a little hook to grab onto the others, keeping everything centered. That's essentially the idea behind checks and balances. The Founding Fathers didn't just divide the government into three branches. They gave each branch specific, targeted powers to limit or check the actions of the other two. This system is the reason no single president, no single Congress, and no single court can seize absolute control. Just to quickly review, we're talking about the three parts of our government. The legislative branch, Congress, writes the rules. The executive branch, President, makes sure everyone follows them. And the judicial branch, courts, is the referee deciding what the rules actually mean. The genius of checks and balances is that these three must work together, but they are also always in a healthy competitive tension with one another. The most famous check the president has on the legislative branch is the veto. When Congress passes a bill, it goes to the president's desk. If the president believes the bill is unwise, too expensive, or just plain bad for the country, they can say no. They sign the bill with a stamp that literally says, "I forbid." This power is so strong that Congress often adjusts bills before they're even voted on, just to make sure they are something the president will sign. The legislative branch has a powerful comeback to the veto, though, the veto override. If a president vetoes a bill, Congress can try to pass it again. However, to override the president, they can't just have a simple majority. They need a massive 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. It's a very high bar to clear. Think of it like this. The president throws a huge boulder in the road, and Congress has to bring a heavy-duty crane to lift it out of the way. One of Congress's most powerful but often overlooked checks is the power of the purse. The executive branch can't spend a single dollar unless Congress authorizes it. Imagine you're trying to run a business, but your partner controls the wallet. You can make all the plans you want, but if they won't fund your projects, they won't happen. This check is why Congress can essentially defund or force changes in executive branch departments they disagree with. When the president decides who to put in charge of a federal agency, or more importantly, who to appoint as a Supreme Court justice, that nominee has to face the Senate. This is a major check on the executive and judicial branches. The Senate holds confirmation hearings, digging into the nominee's background and views. If the Senate doesn't approve the person, the president has to go back to the drawing board. This ensures broad agreement on key leadership roles. The president is the country's main representative to the world, meaning they negotiate all international agreements and treaties. But they can't make a treaty all by themselves. The Senate must approve it with a 2/3 vote. This check prevents a single president from making a rash or dangerous promise to a foreign country that could harm the nation in the long run. It forces consensus before a binding international commitment is made. The most dramatic check is the power of impeachment. If the president or a federal judge commits a serious crime or abuses their power, Congress can remove them. The House brings the formal charges. That's the impeachment. Then, the Senate acts as the jury and holds the trial. This is a rare, severe check, but it confirms that even the most powerful people in government are not above the law and can be held accountable. Moving over to the judicial branch, its greatest power is judicial review. This allows the Supreme Court to look at any law passed by Congress and declare it unconstitutional. It's the ultimate referee call. Imagine you're playing a sport and someone invents a new rule mid-game. The Supreme Court can step in and say, "Wait, that new rule violates the spirit of our constitutional rulebook." This check protects us from harmful or unjust laws. Judicial review doesn't just apply to Congress's laws. It applies to the executive branch as well. If a president issues an executive order, which is basically a policy directive, the Supreme Court can review it. If they find the president has gone beyond the authority granted to them by the Constitution, the court can strike down the entire action. This is a crucial check on presidential power, ensuring even the commander-in-chief stays within the legal limits. The executive branch's most lasting influence on the judicial branch is the power to appoint judges. Federal judges and Supreme Court justices serve for life. When a spot opens up, the president gets to nominate a person who usually shares their political and legal philosophy. By picking a new judge, a president can influence how the laws are interpreted for the next 20 to 30 years, long after their own term has ended. The president also has a check called the power of pardon. This allows the president to legally forgive a person for a federal crime, essentially overriding the court's verdict and sentence. This power is usually reserved for rare situations where the courts may have made a mistake, or when a compassionate decision is warranted. It's an explicit executive check on the final judgment of the judicial branch. The president, as commander-in-chief, can order troops into combat almost instantly, which is a major check on the slow-moving Congress. They don't need to wait for Congress to approve every single military action. However, Congress still holds the ultimate check. Only they can formally declare war, and critically, only they can fund the military operation. So, while the president can start an action, Congress can stop it by cutting off the money. While the Supreme Court is established by the Constitution, Congress holds a significant structural check on the judicial branch. Congress has the power to create all the federal courts that are below the Supreme Court, like the district courts and courts of appeals. They can also change the number of justices on the Supreme Court itself. While it's considered very controversial to use this power, it shows that even the highest court is structurally accountable to the legislature. Much of the government's day-to-day work is done by executive agencies, the FBI, the FDA, the Department of Education, and so on. They are part of the executive branch. To check them, the legislative branch uses oversight. Congressional committees hold regular hearings, grilling agency heads about how they spend money, how they enforce rules, and if they're being effective. It's Congress's way of making sure the president's team is following their legislative directions. Here's a small but fascinating check: the vice president. The VP is part of the executive branch, but they are also technically the president of the Senate, which is legislative. The VP only gets to vote in the Senate when there is a perfect 50-50 tie. When this happens, the executive branch gets to cast the deciding vote in the legislature, which is a very specific, direct check, often influencing close legislation. The ultimate check on all branches is the process of amending the Constitution. If the judicial branch issues a ruling that Congress and the majority of Americans disagree with, or if any branch abuses its power, the people can change the very rules of the game. However, this process requires a massive amount of agreement. 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. It's designed to be incredibly difficult, ensuring that the foundational rules are stable and not changed on a whim. Let's walk through a common example. Congress passes a new law about clean energy. The president, using his veto check, might ask for changes, but eventually the bill gets signed. A year later, a power company sues, claiming the law unfairly affects their business. The case eventually reaches the Supreme Court. The court then uses its power of judicial review to test the law against the Constitution. If it fails, the law is canceled. Here's another example involving all three branches: a Supreme Court vacancy. The president, executive, nominates a candidate. The Senate, legislative, uses its power of confirmation to hold hearings and check the person's qualifications. If the nominee is approved, they become a justice, judicial, and then begin using the power of judicial review to check the actions of the President and Congress. The cycle of checks is constant. Why do we put up with such a complicated, slow system? Because it works. The checks and balances create a necessary tension that forces our leaders to compromise and negotiate instead of acting impulsively. This stability is the key to preserving the American democracy. By limiting the government's power, the system ultimately protects your rights and liberties, ensuring that the government remains a servant of the people, not its master.